Good evening and welcome to Exchanging Notes. I'm John. This evening I have the privilege of conversing with author and journalist James, what is your name? FitzGerald. James FitzGerald. James is the author of Old Boys, The Powerful Legacy of Upper Canada College, a book that in 1994 was a factor in a multi-million-dollar class lawsuit and the criminal conviction of 3 former teachers of Upper Canada College. He is also the author of What Disturbs Our Blood, a son's quest to redeem the past, which explores madness and high achievement within his family, and won the 2010 Writers' Trust Nonfiction Prize. 2018's Dreaming Sally is a story of first love, sudden death, and long shadows in 1968. This evening we will discuss James' life and his craft, and I will start it off by saying welcome, James FitzGerald.
Thank you
for dropping in.
Thank you.
James, you were born in 1950 in Toronto. Does the absolute good fortune of being born in the mid-20th century in Canada, does that ever strike you at times?
Of course. I mean, we were, the boomer generation, privileged Canada, a privileged country, a privileged city, a privileged family. So this has dominated my writing because of the inherent paradox in that being I'm a kind of a quintessential boomer because of the protest element that comes into this, and that I should be completely happy and just go away and shut up, right? I mean, why would I have anything to say? Everything's so wonderful. And because in fact, that's the paradox, that there was deep traumas and tragedies and extreme things within my own family history and school and so on. So I grew up in, blanket silence around this stuff.
A lot of repression.
More British than the British.
Yes. That's what happens with the colonials, isn't it?
That's right.
Now, when you think of the world back then, the 50s in Canada, what are the qualities we've lost? What are the qualities you would like to see regained?
From the 50s?
From the 50s
Not
to
much.
60s? Not much, no?
Well, I only see it's because it's out of my own personal experience. I was a child in the 50s, so that's the seminal reality of my writing that I've for decades I've drilled down to those years.
Yes.
And so there's a central image in my book is the haunted house of my grandfather on Balmoral Avenue. So it's very Gothic and very Victorian, but it's also very 50s. So I kind of conflate those things. And so the nightmares and the extreme neglect as children, we were literally ignored as children. My parents never picked us up or no physical affection, no reading of stories. We were locked in there. And I was going quite stir crazy as a child. So I retreated into myself and read a lot.
You were a loner as a child.
Well, all 3 of us have very little memories of being together. We were isolated, the 3 of us, even though we were close in age.
You're talking about Sheila, your sister, Michael.
And Michael, that's right.
He's your younger brother.
That's right. And then on top of later we'll get into the family drama of the history, but part of my excavation of my family history was that I discovered that my brother was sexually abused when he was 3, 4, and 5 in this house. And that's in my 3rd book. So that's another psychological layer of stuff that informs everything, my sensibility.
Now, when you were growing up, when you're getting into your maybe 10, 11, 12, adolescence, puberty, I think that for some kids, life is, and it makes sense to them because that's the way it is. For other kids, it doesn't make sense. Did life make sense to you back then? Did your parents, for example, did you see their relationship as, if not pleasant, at least stable?
No, that's when I read your early questions, and I was thinking, I was always drawn to like Edward Lear and nonsense and the absurd, and Monty Python was a rescuing experience in the 60s. There was an element of the absurd and the Kafkaesque experience as a child, an alienation and a kind of observing things because of no physicality, because I wasn't touched. I felt unreal. So words and writing was a sort of meta experience, right?
Yeah, so when you actually encounter Kafka, you say, this makes sense.
And television came in in 1953 when I was 3 and 4, so that became wired to Howdy Doody and all that boomer stuff. But only in retrospect can I say this, that if I hadn't delved into this, I think I would have followed the path of my father and grandfather who cracked up.
Now, as you said, you were an older brother. You described yourself in one of your books as a 6-year-old boy in neatly pressed tie and shirt, Prince Oedipus in waiting. Were you a good older brother? Did you handle that role well? Did you feel like there was responsibility that you didn't want to deal with?
Yes, and I think this comes back to my relationship with my brother and his abuse. That was a part of my tie to him. I think I felt guilty that I hadn't protected him.
Yeah.
And that was only a late realization later on when I unpacked this. I would dream about this stuff, you see. That sort of thing. It doesn't make me particularly gifted or psychic. I think all children, we all dream. It's what we do with them. So all of this was inside me, waiting to be unpacked. And if I hadn't unpacked it, it would have just killed me, I think.
There's also that sense that maybe you became aware of later. You say that the root of your name, James, means supplanter.
Right.
Did you kind of feel like, looking at your father, that he was the competition?
Well, he was so distant and absent. It was like not having a father. Okay. So in that sense, you could say, the Freudians would say I won the Oedipal. But I didn't, because my mother was a kind of Teflon figure. She was like watching television. I mean, she was beautiful. She was a movie star. She was glamorous. She was intelligent. She'd worked for MI5 in World War II.
Yeah.
Very charismatic, attractive figure. But it was like she was always 10 feet away.
Yeah.
And so that was a very strange thing. And then I think I was her favorite in a kind of unwholesome way, because later in life, I read about this in the book. It shocked me, but she started, because her marriage was dead.
Yes.
She started to kind of undermine my own romantic relationships. And
so you really feel there was one of those repressed sort of romantic things going on.
That's right.
Does that affect you later? Just that thing of the unassailable, the distant woman that you can't capture?
Huge impact on my own relationships with women. Yeah, that's why I ultimately sought out talk therapy, which I think saved my life, being able to unpack all of this. And I was dreaming ferociously, and these dreams, I was with a brilliant guy who he wasn't interpreting the dreams. He was just saying, James, what do you think?
Yeah.
And it unblocked me as a writer. And so the first book was a direct birth out of that.
Yeah, it's amazing what we know that we don't know we know until somebody points it out.
That's right.
You were an honors student at Upper Canada College. I'd like to talk about UCC a bit more later.
That was the first book, sure, yeah.
But what I would like to ask you is, what qualities made you a successful student in that environment?
Well, you're making the assumption on the word successful here.
Successful.
Because I was certainly a bright kid, but I bought out. Like I hid in the weeds of mediocrity, shall we say, because of I saw what happened to people.
Yes.
They were groomed. Like Michael Ignatieff's a great example.
Yeah.
They would see the bright kids. Now, at one level you think, what's wrong with that? They want to promote the good kids and so on. But when you're so young, when you're 8 and 9 and 10, and your parents, like his parents were diplomats, so they put him in a boarding school. This happened to my father, too.
Yes.
And the third book is all about this. George Orr is a character who was in Michael Ignatieff's class. And so the 60s was about, wait a minute. How about asking the kid what he wants first? There's this assumption that you're put on the waiting list when you're born.
Yes.
So some people go with that and have a good life. Others crack up and die because they sell out the true self, right? Like, that was my father. This was a huge impact on me, that my father became a successful doctor, but he was groomed and coerced and seduced into this. He was longing for his father, who was successful. But he did remarkably well, but he cracked up because he really wanted to be a jazz musician.
Yeah.
But he killed that side of himself. And there's all kinds of stories like this out there, still today. The force of parents and teachers. And you convince yourself that, yes, I really do want to be a lawyer. And then you wake up at 50 and realize, what happened? And if they can't turn it around, my father couldn't. That was the tragedy. At 50, he cracked up, and he couldn't turn his life around.
It's really sort of possibly a way of growing up that retards emotional maturation.
That's right.
It makes you want to be, you have to be the follower.
That's right.
To survive.
Particularly in these families, because they're dynastic families, like the Kennedys. And so it's enormous pressure. Like when I was 8, my father said, you're going to Upper Canada. He's thrilled.
Yeah.
And so I'm supposed to be thrilled. And only later I realized he hated it there. He was in boarding. It was predation going on in the 1920s, boarding houses at Upper
Yes.
Canada. It was worse then. I didn't go into boarding, thank God.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, why? So years later, I'm looking back on this, and I'm sort of, why would he do that?
At Upper Canada College, did you have any favorite teachers? You mentioned, for example, Jack Shafter and
Yes.
Jay McDonald.
He was. There were 2 good teachers in 10 years.
In 10 years.
The first year and the last year. And I thank God for both of them because I wasn't so cynical. Like I didn't, that's how starved I was for a good influence. So when it happened, I knew what it was. This guy loved me and cared about me and challenged me and so on the first year. So I bought into the mythos of the school because of that first teacher. Lovely man. Then it was downhill from there. Bores and sadists and automatons and really bad. And this was in the 60s. So you have to realize that the whole system was being challenged by the 60s.
Yeah.
It was, Queen Victoria meets Jimi Hendrix. And so that generation, we were all confused and Monty Python absurdity. And so, then the last year, I had this lovely teacher who was like the Jack Shafter. And I left on a kind of a good experience in English class with him. One experience.
Do you think he looked at you and saw, I can shape this boy, or I can affect him, and he can do things that I might have wanted to do?
Quite possibly. He was, the thing was, he was a closeted gay man, and that's the thing about that school, too. To this day, they're still closeted. There's a disproportionate number of gay men. Some were great teachers, some were terrible teachers, just like anyone else. And that's another sort of weird, sort of schizoid part of that place.
Yes.
That it's this puritanical, retro, all promoting themselves as progressive, and with the same time when there's no girls there. I mean, it's the most remarkable sleight of hand when they can, in one breath, advertise themselves as the best school in the country. They've said that out loud.
Yes.
And no one challenges this. How is this possible? If you bring in 50% of the smartest girls, academic average goes up.
Yeah.
Just on that level alone. Forgetting about changing the culture of the place if girls are there. I mean, it's remarkable.
It is.
It blows my mind.
In 1972 to 73, you went to University of Western Ontario. You studied journalism.
Yeah.
What was the appeal of journalism at that time?
It was the default position. I didn't know what to do. I'd taken an English degree at Queen's. I was confused. My father had tried to kill himself. My roommate went paranoid schizophrenic. It was a very rocky time for me.
So
that's why I was a word guy. I read a lot. I'd never spoken in class. I still had this split. I invested everything into writing, so people knew I was a good writer, but they were puzzled why I wouldn't speak up. See, I've earned this. That I'm speaking here now is an achievement.
Well, staying quiet is a way of rebelling, isn't it? It's resentment.
It was almost an elective mute, but not quite. I think I experienced it as not actually finding my voice. My voice would just disappear on me. I mean, it was that severe,
Really?
Almost a kind of petrification as a child. Yeah.
So I assume then that you've had 40 years in journalism and publishing, that was one of the ways of helping you to find your voice?
That's right. I had to write my way out of it.
Yes.
And even, like, the new journalism was happening when I was at journalism school for that 1 year, 1972, 73, Watergate. So the personal voice suddenly coming in. So first person, that was very liberating. And as you know, any writer knows, it's really hard and challenging to put your first person, I think and feel this, right? Try it sometime. You got that inner critic. You can't say that. The censoring, voices you imagine that you're going to offend people. It's very powerful just to put it on the page, let alone publish it or let someone read it. That's why a lot of people won't finish books, I don't think, because it's incredibly demanding on you. If you're going to be honest and truthful.
If you're revealing.
That's right. If you're going to go for the truth and really say what you're feeling and stand behind it, it takes courage.
Now, when you think of your time in journalism, what are the jobs that really stand out for you? What was your first job?
I had a small little weekly paper. But those years, I have to tell you, I wasn't really happy in them. It was because it was this preliminary. These three things were all incubating inside me. They were eating, and I had Crohn's disease. It was eating me up. Yeah. I didn't know it. I didn't know why, because of the silence of all of these incredible stories that are in here, and I was stumbling around in my relationships, and I was drinking too much. So the journalism was just kind of a place to go and tap out hack articles that I didn't really have my heart in. I had some fun and stuff, but it was still a sort of a treading water in my 20s.
An excuse to smoke and drink.
Yeah, like a lot of people in their 20s
Like all
do.
people in
But
their
there was sort of a
20s, yeah.
waiting, like when am I going to grow up and wake up and whatever this thing. And I delayed going into therapy because of what happened to my father and grandfather. There's
Yes.
shocking malpractice of this. Here are these two doctors who are cracking up and are reaching out for help. And for their trouble, they are shocked and drugged and become even more suicidal. They're backed into a corner and remarkably insensitive maltreatment, and this is all documented. I got all of their records out of the hospital. So naturally, I'm a bit gun-shy about seeking help from anybody. And just luckily, I found a really amazing man. And,
Did you find in journalism, were there any mentors, people who guided you through?
No.
Did you feel left alone?
My therapist at age 33 was the first mentor I ever had in my life.
Really?
Yeah, that was, again, the isolation, you see, because of the lack of a father. He just didn't, it was like being an orphan. He just didn't exist, and he didn't care. I don't know why he had children. It's all in the pathos of his psychiatric records from the Clark, where he says to one of the psychiatrists, he actually says he's feeling guilt. He says, I can count on my one hand the number of times I took my children out.
Yeah.
And so he did, so to his credit, he did feel some guilt about it. I was amazed to read that he actually, I didn't think he even thought of that.
Sometimes we learn too late, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, he's a tragedy, my father.
Now, in 1994, you published Old Boys, The Powerful Legacy of Upper Canada College.
Right.
I'd like to ask you about the genesis of this first book.
Yes.
Why that book at that time?
Yep.
And do you remember when you decided to write it?
I do. It was coming right out of this experience. So in 1983, I'm 33, I go in, I meet this man, I'm dreaming, and I'm unpacking myself. And one of the themes I was talking about was certainly absent father, but Upper Canada is filled with father-son dramas, just filled with them, hundreds of them, good and bad. And I was complaining to Peter that I was trying to write, but I couldn't find my voice. I just couldn't, I was blocked. And I read Studs Terkel, who wrote this amazing book called Working, where all he did was take a tape recorder and interview people on the street at random of all backgrounds. It could be a bank president or a hockey player or a prostitute or a street sweeper, and talk to me about work. Just tell me, just first person. I'll sit here and I'll shut up. And it's amazing what came out of people.
When they're given permission to talk.
And they spoke from their heart, and there was passion, and there was honesty, and I was riveted by that book. Because what was coming through was most people hated their jobs. Mm-hmm. The honesty of this. Like they wanted to do something else. That's what I was feeling. I'm on my way to something else that I haven't found yet. So I said, I got to apply that technique to Upper Canada College because of the personal, subjective voice that was being eradicated in me. Like, you can't say that. You can't feel that. That's the way I was raised.
Now, you conducted a bit over 70 interviews.
300 interviews.
300 in total.
We picked 70, and we juxtaposed them, and they were all banging into each other. So you get all the famous people like Conrad Black and Michael Ignatieff and Ted Rogers, and then you interview the obscure, anonymous, scapegoated boy or the gay boy or who's in the next room or in the boarding house, and they tell the truth.
Yeah.
So you sort of, when you read the book, you're scanning all these voices, and it's sort of this kaleidoscopic. I don't write anything. I'm inviting the reader to interpret this as an ink blot.
I guess when you're dealing with someone like Robertson Davies or David Gilmour, you know you're dealing with a storyteller.
And they're media savvy, and they know what they're doing, so you have to read between the lines. And
no, I think the first word was right.
So yes, that's right. So the irony, and that's right. So the searingly honest ones would punch through. And you see, by accident, I didn't do this by design. I'd heard rumors about sexual predation, but they kind of, because of my therapy, I learned how to listen. Like, stop being a journalist, stop asking questions. If you give a person a chance, they'll tell you it's the most amazing phenomenon. They'll tell a stranger the most intimate secrets. So complete strangers were telling me about their sex lives and the abuse they experienced in the boarding house. And I'm just sitting there, and I have to keep a poker face. I'm thinking, oh my God, what I've tapped into here, is this going to go into the book? And I think, yes. Now, when it comes out, I was interviewed on Ian Brown on CBC Radio. Nobody touched this stuff.
Really?
In 1994, this was still too hot.
Really?
Now, the school just went into apoplexy.
Yes.
Or denial, like the book didn't exist. That's what they do, right? This is a recapitulation of my original experience. You don't exist.
Yeah.
What voice? What are you talking about? What book?
It's interesting because I guess what you learned during the interviews was to be silent and just let them have their space.
That was the irony.
But silence was the enemy.
Yes, because I was trying to find my voice, and that's the irony, that my first book wasn't my voice. So they taught me, so the second book is my voice.
Yes.
At age 40, I'm finally finding it.
It's about the right time. Now, the interviews, of course, a lot of them surprised you, but when you said about 300 interviews, you culled it down to about 70.
Yeah.
When you were shaping the book, did you learn anything about the dynamics among the interviews that shaped the book?
The organizing principle rose up. I had a brilliant editor. Everybody needs a great editor. I mean, these books wouldn't be what they are without these editors. First class, Gary Ross, Ann Collins, amazing. So Gary and I were wrestling with all of these massive manuscripts, and they magically, serendipitously, synchronistically would start to come together. Like they would link.
Yep.
Like we talked to David Gilmour one minute, and then Perrin Beatty, who was a cabinet minister, was his roommate, and they would independently talk of the same incident and have completely different takes on it.
Really?
So it's like editing pieces of film. So you would put them in here, and you would move from one voice to the next, like a film. And that's when we realized how we had to organize the book. I didn't know that when we went in, and so this had a remarkable effect. And a lot of people just didn't get it, like they didn't want to, or didn't see the inherent challenge, because a lot of the stories were very positive. It wasn't a hatchet job on the school.
Yes.
It was a mirror of what actually went on there.
Yes.
A lot of really wonderful, brilliant, inspiring stuff, and then criminal stuff, and then back and forth. And so why aren't the good guys doing anything about the bad guys? And
now, aside from Studs Terkel, his book on work, were there any other books you looked to as models, or models of composition, or what have you?
No, the Suds one was the direct model for Old Boys. There was no question about that. And as I say, it was a stepping stone to the bravery some of those people showed. Right? They weren't all brave, but the ones that were inspired me. They gave me something. Well, so like I was invading their privacy. Okay, James, now you got to invade your own privacy.
Yeah.
So I had to dish for the next book. That was the standard that I'd set. Okay, how honest can I be? How open can I be? And challenge the gods of shame. Because that's what we're fearing. You're going to be shamed into silence.
And they needed you, didn't they? They needed someone to tell their story to, and in turn, you needed someone to tell your story to.
And I wasn't ready. I remember even trying. I said to somebody during the middle of that process, "You interview me," and how hard it was for me to verbalize my 10 years, because it was so complex. It wasn't a monolithic experience. That's why it was so compelling, because I had good things and bad things, but it was just as ultimately a kind of absurd feeling to it.
Now, in a nutshell, what did the composition and publishing of Old Boys teach you about the craft of writing and yourself?
Well, this is it. I was doing this hack journalism, and I hadn't really found myself as a writer yet. So this was the springboard into the next phase. So here is Old Boys being published, and a very muted response to it, because the stuff was so disturbing. It was blowing up the whole and challenging things, and it had to be kind of quietly put away. But it did have this effect of having other people come forward, and so there were 3 teachers ultimately jailed in the class.
Yes.
So it had this catalyzing effect. Meanwhile, I'm moving on to my story. It's time for me to drill into the FitzGerald stuff.
And we are talking here about What Disturbs Our Blood, a son's quest to redeem the past.
That's right.
Published by Random House in 2010, based upon the National Magazine Award-winning article, Sins of the Fathers. 16 years between Old Boys and What Disturbs Our Blood.
Right.
What were you doing at that time? How did you decide to write What Disturbs Our Blood? How much of that 16 years was composition, and how much of it was just kind of dancing around the decision?
Both, yeah, all these things. I had just, Old Boys had come out, and I was segueing into the next logical phase. Like I have to say, invade my own privacy. And I went into CAMH archives, January 1995, 2 months after the book came out. I'm ready to sort of take on this beast of the secret and silent suicide of my eminent grandfather, founder of the Connaught Labs, Dean of Medicine at U of T, international superstar in public health, Rockefeller Foundation, League of Nations, were amazing. I knew nothing about him. My father never spoke of him. I'm thinking, there's a book there.
It's strange, isn't it, that your father never spoke of him, as if he resented him.
This is why he became suicidal. It was this unconscious tie to his father to reenact the drama. So I was sort of picking up on this in my therapy. I was like, I'm teed up. I'm the eldest son. I'm next. So I'm going to find out. I have to be a detective, and I have to. So I went to the archives at CAMH, and this incredible, quote, coincidence, of which I have experienced many. You sometimes think there's an invisible hand at work when you commit yourself to these things, and it's remarkable how they just come up to meet you if you really are dedicated to going at this. So I walk into the archives, and that week, 60 confessional letters written by my grandfather in the last year of his life in an asylum in the States were donated. They've been sitting in a house for 45 years. They showed up with dust, and I walk in, FitzGerald, Connaught Labs, Dr. FitzGerald, he freaks out, the archivist, and he puts it in my lap, and I open it up, and there's these incredible letters of this man who is a complete ghost and mystery to me, and he comes alive in these powerful letters where he's in great despair, and he's saying, I've committed the unpardonable sin and the penalty is death. It's very dramatic. There's a rosebud, there's a novel, there's a book, there's a nonfiction. That's when I knew I had a book.
You quote Yeats in the beginning of the book. You say, what disturbs our blood is but its longing for the tomb. Now, is that sort of desire for death, was that sort of the predicating principle of the book, something you had accepted and were trying to build on, or did you come to that realization? The
title came at the very end. I had no title. The working title was An Irish Madness, which was kind of unfair to the Irish, sort of pin it on them, because I went back to Ireland and I did an unbelievable amount of research on every conceivable angle, because I was in a sense doing 3 generations of therapy myself for them, because it was all undone, not done for them, and so that's why it took so long. And so yes, sorry, I lost your question again.
Desire for death.
Oh yes, thank you. Dissociated from that. Yeah, that's right. That a writer friend of mine gave me that quote right at the end, and I had actually written it in the book out of my own writing. That phrase, "disturbing the blood," and I didn't even know that it was a Yeats's phrase. Maybe I did know it unconsciously, but it's right. It's about the death instinct. I mean, suicide is a death wish.
Also, possibly the sense that what has this wish is not you. It's something that's invaded you. But the redemptive side of it, what could be, of course, is that art, writing these books, is a way of cheating that death.
Absolutely. Art and life, that's what's so powerful about this, and the therapy and the dreaming. And I was being enlivened by facing these demons, and with help. You see, I couldn't have done it alone. I mean, the myth of the writer in the garret, it's wrong. I mean, you can't do it. You have to do this. You have to talk. And I did a lot of talking to people, to friends, as I went in the archives, and you're not going to believe what I found today. And I kept finding things, that my grandfather's brother jumped off a bridge, and these things had all been suppressed.
You talk about in the book, you talk about you say the pulled the strings. At last I could pull back. So you had that sense of being a divided self and doing battle within yourself.
That's right. That's right. There's, again, the speaking and writing idea, right? That I had a terrible time. When I went into a group therapy, I was suddenly thrown back to my childhood, and I could speak like this, one-on-one with people, be articulate. No, he's an articulate, smart, well-read guy. And then I would go into a room with 10 or 12 people and disappear, clam up. And I was puzzled by it as much as my therapist. What happened to you, James? It was an incredible split, and it made me aware of it, So I had to fight inch by inch, taking risks.
Well, you say, the spirit of my grandfather was wedged in the heavy space between myself and my most intimate relationships. And that's a theme that comes back in your books time and time again, that absence controls presence. Someone not being there is as strong a presence as their actual presence.
Very, very right, very perceptive, absolutely. No, it was ghosts. I grew up in a haunted house full of ghosts, no bodies. And not being touched just reinforced this. I might as well have been raised by ghosts. I mean, I still can't believe it. I mean, people, when I tell this, it sounds so extreme. So, really? Did your mother never touch you? If she did, it was brushing me accidentally. But there was almost a conscious policy. Because her mother was like this. I ultimately forgive her because I understand where it came from. And I know that she was conflicted and felt guilty. When she died, I found her diaries, and you could see that she's racked with guilt.
Now, you talked about, you interviewed a lot of people who had known your grandfather. And I mean, you can't really give a resume of your grandfather's accomplishments as you've listed them. They're
Astonishing.
They're astonishing.
Yeah.
But what did you learn about your grandfather talking about to his acquaintances that really struck you, that made him make sense to you?
Well, it was the letters that were the gold mine, yeah.
Okay.
Because he's writing Fred Banting, his friend, because he was responsible for making insulin at the Canaan, right? I mean,
Yes.
he was a key player, and Charles Best said there'd be no insulin without FitzGerald.
And he did it at a low cost.
This was what was brilliant. I mean, it was a vision of Canada was like a third world country, and Toronto was a cesspool in World War I. And it was this remarkable achievement of turning Canada around within one generation to the point where the Americans and the Europe, he went abroad to study. It's a very Canadian thing to do, right? Bring the knowledge back, cherry pick from Harvard and Berkeley and the Pasteur Institute. He has this vision. He's still in his 20s. And I'm going to make a system that tops theirs. And so we wipe out diphtheria before anyone else. We make insulin, and everybody's, what are those hayseeds in Toronto doing? The Europeans like, who are these guys?
Nah.
Because one of his genius was he hired geniuses. So he had this incredible team of people around him.
Your account of the medical personalities of that time,
Yeah.
I've never read about so many people who needed so much healing. Banting, for example.
Yes.
I mean, some of the theories they explored, frontal lobotomies, insulin shock for psychosis.
Brutal stuff.
They had, it would seem they had a sense of their patients as being there as objects that they would experiment.
Experimental animals, yeah. Again, if you put this in a novel, no one would believe it. This is why I've always been a nonfiction writer, because it's so bizarre and strange. You couldn't invent this. If you put it in a novel, you could say it was contrived.
Yes.
So here's the man responsible for making insulin for the millions of diabetics, millions of lives saved. He's a guinea pig in the Hartford Institute. They give him 57 insulin shock treatments.
Yeah.
And if you've seen A Beautiful Mind, it's like a medieval torture.
Yeah.
You go into comas and sweats and thrashings, and the guy who invented it said it's a brutal invasion of the organism. It was discredited. 5% of the patients died on the table.
Really?
And they just kept plowing ahead. I mean, the guy was obsessed with winning the Nobel Prize, and they could get away with it in those days. I mean, it's a scandalous thing. But here, if you put that in a novel, that the man who made insulin is now subjected to this, and then the minute he gets out of the hospital, he kills himself.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about Canadian heroes, your grandfather, Frederick Banting, who are your favorite? Who is your favorite Canadian hero and why?
Not any doctors.
No, not even Banting?
Well, Banting, because he was an artist at heart.
Yes.
He's a tragic figure too, because he was, like I'm talking earlier about not picking the right profession. Like, he really wanted to paint with a group of 7. He was a very sloppy scientist. Best was the really rigorous scientist.
Yeah.
And Banting's a bit of a tragic figure, died young too in a plane crash.
In a plane crash?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly admire him, but I sympathize with him most and everything, because it was intense pressure on him. At 29, he kind of lucked into insulin. He dreamt it, by the way.
Really?
He dreamt it. He knew nothing about diabetes, zero. So there was an element of stumbling onto something by luck. My grandfather recognized this, that he was an intuitive genius, because he followed up on the dream. He took it seriously. He went to U of T and said, tie this duct here, and they went, well, what are you talking about? And it's remarkable.
Does the study and comprehension of your dreams, does that still influence you as much as it has?
Absolutely. No, there's some of the dreams I've had were just sort of templates that guided me along the path. Because I would be interviewing my grandfather in my dreams, for example.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How's he look?
Well, like those silent movies where they're all running around fast. He was always running ahead, the manic-driven guy who doesn't have time to talk to his son or his grandson, right? Because he neglected his own children profoundly. So a lot of very public people are like this, who are so driven and charismatic and have a fantastic public persona, but you don't want them as parents,
I'd like to ask you about a phrase. Chapter 28 is entitled "The Archaeology of Silence."
Yeah.
In a simple phrase, what is the archaeology of silence?
Everything that we're talking about.
Everything we're talking about.
This digging. It's the best metaphor I could come up with, because of this. I can't underestimate the blanket silence of my childhood and all of these incredibly profound Greek drama is going on underneath. And so children pick this up, right? I mean, on the cover you see, I didn't pick that cover, photograph, but my editor did. Like, she picks a photograph. I gave her 100. That's me at 3, standing in front of my grandfather's house. And you can see the expression on his face says it all, doesn't it? There's this mixture of curiosity and fear, too. Like, what's going on? You know, like kids, like dogs, you know, they're intuiting something.
They pick up on things, don't they?
That's right.
Now, when you said your brother was abused in your grandfather's house, when did you find that out? What was the
when Old Boys came out,
okay,
we went out to dinner, 1995, and it was sort of like permission to the Old Boys as much as to my brother.
Yeah.
Right? So now it's sort of, that's what has to happen. Someone just has to sort of give permission. It's in a book. People are talking about it. You can now talk. That's why it was clammed up. No one decided to write about Upper Canada from 1829 to 1994. They got a pass.
Because there were things there.
Because of the intimidation of the power elite. You don't question them. And I'm amazed that I was the first to do it, you know. And so my brother very touchingly comes forward to me, the book, and it was sort of an open secret in my family. We all sensed something had happened to him.
Yeah.
But then he told me over dinner, and it was this most remarkable thing. It was an uncanny I was having all the feelings as he was talking. He was talking in a very dissociated way about it, but in great detail.
Yeah.
He remembers it from age 3, 4, and 5. The live-in help up on the 3rd floor of my grandfather's house.
Wow.
And it was verified. We went to our mother, and she verified it. She said, "Oh yeah, I got a phone call of the wife of the pedophile, and he went to jail for abusing a bunch of boys, including Michael." And I believe I witnessed it because of my dreams and the way my nervous system was kind of fried by it.
Now, it's been 25 years since your first book. You're 3 books later. What are some of the important things about your craft that you now know but didn't in the beginning?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
No?
I mean, it's if you want to do it well, I mean, that's if you're going to shoot high, and as back to what I said earlier, if you're going to be honest to your experience, it's very, very demanding. And I was lucky enough to meet editors that made all the difference. Because if I was alone, I feel for a lot of writers who are brilliant and talented, but don't get published by a big publisher, or don't find the right editor, or can't get in the door, you know.
The quality of endurance, isn't that really...
Tenacity is the number one thing, I think.
I mean, if you survived 11 years at Upper Canada College not liking it,
that's right.
That's simple endurance. That's putting your head down. That's the dark side of the Protestant work ethic, really, isn't it?
Right on, exactly. And you see, the upside was like they hammered these British. It was this alcoholic British repressed bachelor who would beat us, but he would drill spelling and grammar. I mean, in grade 7 and grade 8 would be drilled into us like military drill. Yeah. So it was a fear, based curriculum. But I got very good at it. So I was sort of, I had to be first in spelling. Had to be. So I have all this vocabulary crammed in me, right? But it ended up being a kind of a burden because I'm trying to strip it down to the basic sentences. Like Hemingway was a good influence. Like strip it down to basic declarative, bang, bang, active verb, this happened. And that's why the writing was therapeutic, because it was like standing on my own experience and ready for anyone to push me off of it.
What are your strengths as a writer? What are your weaknesses, and how did you work on those weaknesses?
I think, the editors I overwrote frantically. Yes. But this reduction, that's the tightest, succinct writing that you can do is the discipline and the challenge, right?
And that's what you feel you've learned in the past?
That's right. It was a slow, laborious process, and especially it was amazing because with What Disturbs, there was so much material. I was overwhelmed by it, the epic levels of the story.
Yes.
And I didn't think I was despair. The biggest thing I had to overcome in that book was my feeling of despair, because I'll never finish it. It's too big. It took me 15 years as it was.
Yeah.
But I did finish it, and I did push through, and I did get rewards afterwards, and that gave me a lot of confidence. So the rewards, when it was published, the experience from 2010 on was fantastic, because then I was kind of forced into this situation, into the limelight. I have to speak about it. Yeah. And I was sort of dissociated from my own achievement, if you understand what I'm saying, because I had no feedback or mirroring of you're never good enough, right, in that world. My grandfather killed himself because he thought he was a loser. He had no sense of his own achievement. He was so isolated in it, and I was similar. So when people gave me praise, I would always sort of look over my shoulder. I couldn't quite bring myself into my own achievement, if you follow me. Now that's changed since 2010, where I've had these lovely experiences where people are listening and respectful and ask me a question, and I realize I'm the guy who wrote that book.
And I've got something to say.
And I can enter that body and claim it as my own. So the process is continuing, if you follow me.
Do you still have that sense of divide itself, or is that...
It's an ongoing thing. It's much, much better, but it will be with me till I die. I think that the cleaving was like a meat cleaver right down the... But I've healed so much of it, and this is the paradox. I write about this process.
Yes.
And try to help people grapple with their versions of this. And,
When you're working on a book, what is your routine? If you're halfway through something, it's fairly well shaped. What kind of day are you spending?
It was sort of, I tell young writers this, it's you find your own idiom, right? There's no hard and fast rules. That's the challenge and the task. So you give yourself permission to, the old joke about when writers look out the window for 2 hours, they're actually working. It's true.
Yeah.
Like the mental effort required, and piling up notes and files and getting overwhelmed and trying to get some kind of coherent structure and wrestling with all that day in, day out, day in, day out. You have to take a lot of breaks.
When you were working on What Disturbs Our Blood, and quite possibly just being flooded away by the amount of material, was there a point where you suddenly said to yourself, I've got it now, this is the shape?
Yes, again, just like all the books, you have to sort of jump off the deep end and not worry about that. Just have faith that the structure will present itself. I just wade into the deep end and drown a bit. And then I had, by the third book, I had enough good experience, especially with Anne, who I love and trust. And because God bless her, she's a remarkable person. I call it her compassionate ruthlessness, because some editors can be just pricks, right? And she is just wham, but she loves me and I love her. There's a sense of solidity there. And the first book was, What Disturbs was initially, the first draft was like a 1,000-page book. I dropped this on her, and I was like enacting, okay, she's going to be like my mother, and she's going to tell me to go away. She's going to fire me.
Yeah.
And she handed it back and said, cut it in half and come back.
How long did that take?
She sat on it for a year, and then with the editing was years, of course. And at one point she wrote in the margins, okay, James, it's official. I'm drowning in side trips. So many tangents, right? Because I was so fascinated by all the subtexts and I had to research the hell out of everything. So I just sort of lobotomy. I would write 10 pages when I only needed to write 2.
Now, when you were working on Dreaming Sally, did that editorial experience come in handy? Did you sort of edit yourself more?
I still overwrote. Like she still kind of scolded me when I gave her the first. I said, James, you've done it again, but not as badly.
Yeah.
But we still had to take out 150 pages because, again, overwrote.
Yeah.
Because where that comes from is from my early life. I don't think anyone's listening.
So you have to say it again and
I have
again.
to keep pounding in, are you getting it? And I'm demanding a response, aren't I? Like, this is good, this is bad, I don't, because everybody was dissociating in my family, right?
Yeah.
When you're passionately trying to entreat somebody to hear you, like a child in the nursery.
Yes.
It's literally, that's the metaphor. When you're crying, when you're one, you're crying for help, and then nobody comes, and you cry in protest, and no one comes, and then you stop crying.
And the silence speaks the most.
And then you're locked in to this place, and you become very compliant. So I became a good boy. That was my tactic. My sister kept protesting. My older sister was like, she was the hellion, raising hell. I was going, oh, that's not working.
Yeah.
I better just sit at my mother's feet and make no trouble. Right?
Yeah. You have written a lot of sentences, and you've even published some of them. Tell me about this. How does a sentence work singly and in combination with other sentences? What is a good sentence?
Whoa.
That's a big one.
I know. I mean, again, that's one of the mysteries of composition, right? I mean, the best, it's an old analogy, but music, a symphonic flow, rhythm, I really pay attention to that. So it's a lot of kind of throwing stuff on the page at random. It's almost like puzzle pieces, or that's how I do it. So I throw a kind of the raw sewage on the page, and the notes and the stuff that I pick up in the shower, and notes and ideas and images, and then how do I hew that into a paragraph? I think I thought would do it more in paragraphs, sentences and paragraphs, and then try to link them up.
Do you read aloud? Are you concerned about the orality of the
Yes,
sentence?
very much, yeah.
Yeah.
Irish kind of musicality. I see jazz, my father was a jazz hound, right? So there was
Yeah.
jazz on. I grew to hate jazz, but he knew Duke Ellington personally and Count Basie, and he would smoke grass with them. He was a hipster. That's what he should have done. He should have opened a jazz club in Toronto because he had access to all of these black geniuses. He knew them all personally, Django Reinhardt. But he went and became an immunologist and hated it. And so music was always, in the 60s music, was like Jimi Hendrix trumps Duke Ellington, you know.
Did your mother have artistic interests?
You see, that's what I think happened was she was so the frustrated 50s housewife, brilliant, but pre-feminist Toronto, and I think I played out her unlived life.
Yeah.
And then she both envied and admired and envied and then started to undercut me. Because on one hand, I think she was excited that she was seeing me start to have those aspirations, but at the same time, treated me like a sibling. And it was like rivalrous.
And you don't need a sibling, you need a mother.
Exactly, right.
In 2018, you published Dreaming Sally, a true story of first love, sudden death, and long shadows. Now, if we look at your three books, what we see quite distinctly is a Bildungsroman. We see a young man's coming of age, a young man's education. When you look at these three books as a continuum of narrative, do you see recurring preoccupations, themes,
Absolutely.
philosophic concerns? What
Yep.
strikes you now, looking at them all together?
You see, I didn't conceive them as a trilogy. You see, they kind of grew, one turtle grew out of the next turtle. Right?
Yeah.
And the Sally one is a kind of a recapitulation of all the themes, and I use it, I pin it on the story of, again, very, very deeply personal story of this girl, first girl I was in love with when I was 17, Sally, and she's sort of a metaphor for the 60s of all this hope.
Yes.
And because there were no girls around, I overinvested when a real one showed up, who wasn't my mother and who was down to earth and funny and the first girl I had erotic feelings for. Of course, I fall for her big time. Of course, I do.
Yeah.
But it's too intense. And one of the beautiful things about it was she handled it very gracefully. And this other guy, George, was in love with her. So it's a triangle story.
Yes.
So what I didn't know until 30 years after the fact was in 1968, I'm on this trip in Europe with Sally, the student trip. I'm falling for her. What I didn't know was that George had a dream before the trip that Sally was going to die in Europe that summer. And he's convinced of this, and he tells her, don't go to Europe. He's begging her. He's madly in love with her. He's an Upper Canada College old boy.
Yeah.
He's the same, he's almost my doppelganger. Cold mother, absent drunk father, war traumatized father, very similar. He's in Michael Ignatieff's class. He's being groomed. He hates it. He's very bright, but he falls for Sally like mad. And as I say, I didn't learn about this dream until 30 years after the fact. And this uncanny thing happens where on this 8-week trip in Europe, she's going to be home in 2 weeks. He can't bear it. He's convinced the dream is going to come true. He sends her a telegram. We're in West Germany on August 12th, 1968. Telegram, I love you. Will you marry me?
On August the 12th.
August 12th. I walk into her room, August 12th, and she shows me the telegram. I'm 17 going on 11, and I burst into tears. She says, I'm going to marry this guy, George, who's 21. She's 18. I'm 17.
Yes.
Within hours, she's killed in a freak accident.
On the 13th.
The next morning. So you can imagine where that sent George.
Yes.
I told you so. And he went into a spiral. It was like an Orpheus myth, right? You really see the underworld, and it's a mythic story. And so in 1998, when I learned this, that's when I was in the middle of What Disturbs Our Blood. I'm thinking down the road, that might be the third book. But I would have to ask his permission. I wouldn't do that without his permission, because his first two marriages collapsed under the ghost of Sally and his other ghosts in his family, you know. And this guy is being groomed to be prime minister. I mean, he's brilliant.
Did you sometimes look around you and think, my God, that guy's living my life and that guy's living my life?
When he gave permission, and after, when What Disturbs came out, just before that, I went to him, and he lives in Vancouver, and I pitched to him, I said, what do you think, George? You know, I'm a published author now. I can do this book, but I won't do it unless you want to. And he was incredibly ambivalent. He went to the West to escape what he called the upper Canadian, you know, curse.
Yeah.
And he'd reinvented himself, and his third marriage is stable, and he has 3 kids, and he's sort of, part of him is like, go away.
Yeah.
Another part of him is, no, I want to face this. I need to clean this out of myself. We can do this together. And that's indeed what we did.
You say in the book, you say, yes, a book can heal, but a book can re-traumatize. Is that something you learned after doing a couple of books?
Absolutely, because so many of these books are personal with real names of real people. I take risks, right? So like in the family book, there's my brother, my sister. My sister was not happy with me doing the book because she went up the stairs to find my father dying of a morphine overdose when she was 20, and this deeply shamed her. Yes. She carried the shame of this, not him. And I'm now going to be presumptuous enough to write a book about this, and write it from her. How dare I, in some level, write a scene, which I did, of her going up the stairs and what's going on with her as she's going up and saving her father's life. It was an incredibly primal scene. Mm-hmm. So I asked her permission. I said, would you help me with this? And it was a real risk because she could have, we were rocky at the time, actually. We weren't getting along. And she could have told me to, no, 1,000 times, no, I forbid you. Now, she didn't. And she wrote it out. I know she was not happy because she was expecting what I'm telling you. She was expecting to be shamed.
Yes.
And when the book came out, the opposite happened. That was what I was trying to say. Trust me, Sheila. People came out of the woodwork. She said, nothing but good has come from this book. People that she knew at school came up to her with empathy and sympathy, and we didn't know. Of course they didn't know. So that's what I'm challenging.
Has your relationships with your brother and your sister, have they been affected a lot by your work?
Yes, hugely. And my brother I'm closer to because of the abuse. And we've grown and evolved together with this. I mean, it's sort of family therapy on one level, among other things. But yes, that's been the power of the book. I mean, that's what, it's amazing, isn't it? Words in a book.
Yeah.
How they can upset people and heal people. They can do all kinds of things. Well, it's just a book.
Yeah. The words that are there, but also the words that are not there, where the spaces you leave where people insert their own stories. It's really...
Yes.
Now, you're a very layered writer. There's a lot of devices, a lot of sort of prescient irony and sort of imagistic things you do that seem to belong more to the novel. Have you ever attempted a novel, or does nonfiction serve that purpose for you?
Well, as I said, I probably would if I had time, but I'm catching up to all this bizarre truth in my life. You see, that's what I keep saying, right? That if I had written these 3 books as novels, they wouldn't be publishable because they'd be too far out. They'd be too contrived. Yeah. I mean, finding the letters when I did, and the George's Dream, and these are all true things, but you see what I'm saying? Like, it's out of races my own imagination.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, the one thing that struck me in Dream Valley, the one scene was where I think the guy who wants to drive, but they won't let him drive, John, gets behind the wheel of the van that Sally's in, and the guy who's leading the tour says that's a mistake, but he doesn't do anything.
Doesn't turn back. He's lived with that his whole life.
And I would assume also the driver and also you.
I changed it. It's the only ones whose name I changed. I mean, I called him, I told him, I said, I'm going to write this book, and I know this has haunted you, too, as much as George and me, and how do you feel about it? I called him, and there was a pause on the phone. I said, would you be comfortable talking about describing that day and what happened? And there's a pause, and he says, actually, no, I would not be comfortable talking about that. Yeah. And then we're trained as journalists, the 10-second rule, you wait, because they do want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Because he is alone with it. And that was the old boy rule, too. If you sit there, and if you leave, you're going to miss the story. Because most times, people want to talk. Mm-hmm. There's a need to talk. Because it's like a father confessor. The guilt people feel. So that's indirectly, that's what I was inviting them to look at their guilt, because I was feeling guilt, too. And maybe we'll do this together. Now, of course, I'm going to fail in many cases. I'm going to win in some cases. So in his case, he started telling me about it on the phone. Yeah. So I got that information, and then I said, I can change your name, whatever you like, and he agreed to that. And I'll send you what I wrote, like I did with my sister in the suicide scene. She saw it, and help me with this, and invite them in, and that's what happened. And then, unfortunately, he got cold feet. And I sent it to him, and he wouldn't acknowledge that he received it, and I called him, And then he just ignored me, and then he finally sort of exasperated said, "Go away, I don't want any part of this," and changed my name, and that's it. So you see, I'm in a dilemma there. So what am I supposed to do, not publish the book? You know?
Well, you have to, don't you, really?
Yeah. I mean, you know, this is one of the tricky things about being journalists, and we have a reputation for being assholes, for invading places that we shouldn't be invading, and, you know, I tilt on the side of I've done more good than harm, I think. You know.
Now, was Sally, the death of Sally, was that sort of a tipping point for you? Did life kind of get better after that? You were part of a collective there for a while, the Inkerman Collective.
That was George. George was the hippie living in this house, yeah. And they became 1970 classic first wave boomers with the organic farm and doing magic mushrooms and all of that stuff. I mean,
do you remember the hope of that day, how the world suddenly became color? And
absolutely.
It wasn't about the work ethic, and it wasn't about doing well at school.
That's right.
Yeah,
I was right. That was hugely influential on me. It was tapping into what I was already becoming at Upper Canada. So there was a kind of tacit permission given.
Yes.
And this ironic kind of the classical education of Socrates and asking questions, right, which is part of my education. And then this counterculture was saying the same thing. Yeah. Question all assumptions. So the irony is that Old Boys questions everything, the assumptions of the whole place, and they don't want no part of it. It's a group think. It's the most remarkable thing. You can get a quite sophisticated education, teaching you to have critical thinking skills and think for yourself, and then you'll find this herd of people who are in this club who will not brook anything that contradicts their worldview. Yeah. It's the most remarkable contradiction.
That's actually a question I wanted to ask you earlier. When you look at the ethos of Upper Canada College and sort of the patriarchal colonial mindset that it represented, is there still any part of that ethos that still makes sense in the 21st century?
Well, that's the irony, isn't it? The world we're in now, right, where opinion has replaced fact, right? So the whole 60s thing is about feel first, right? So now it's carried to an absurd degree now. So I could argue for the old world, let's bring back some reason and logic and fact.
Let's bring back Socrates.
Let's bring back some of this Upper Canada sort of structure and discipline. And that's the irony in 50 years full circle, right?
Yeah. Speaking of structure and discipline and irony, let's talk about Canada. You've been here for quite a while. What is Canada getting right? What does Canada need to work on? Do you have a succinct message for this country? We're now 1/5 of the way into the 21st century. You're a writer. You must have a message. What is your message for Canada?
I wouldn't presume. I don't know. That's a tough question because again, it's the sense of what we've been talking about tonight. I mean, because I come out of that particular place, so it's through the lens of English Canada, elites, right? That's what's formed me. So I'm as a critic of it. So the idea of leadership. I mean, there were a lot of brilliant stuff in the book who critiqued this, right? From what is Canada? Like Stephen Clarkson went to town on the Canadian elites. You guys, we've been overwhelmed by the Brits first, and then the Americans, and they haven't been able to carve out a sense of what the Canadian elites identifying their own fortunes with the country. Like insulin was farmed out to Denmark. It isn't a national brand. We have this weird self-effacing, post-colonial weirdness that
people like to characterize it as humility. I really think it's a lack of confidence.
Yes.
And a lack of, if you look at Canada and you look at the US, you have one difference between the two, which is the act of mythologizing the culture.
That's right.
And we don't do that. Why do you think we don't do that?
It's a strange thing. I think it's the vastness of the country and the winners and the huddling and the pioneering thing, and we had to be egalitarian, and the tall poppy thing, like don't let anybody get too big for their britches.
Yeah.
My grandfather, you see, was a tall poppy who wasn't allowed. He was self-effacing.
Yeah.
And remarkable.
Does it have to do with the cold? We have to stick together because it's so
and it's
cold?
an attitude of heroism. There was a great quote in the book by Jan Morris, the American writer, said, the Canadians have a genius for turning the heroic into the banal.
That's it.
That's the Vimy Ridge and Banting and my grandfather. It's true. Like there's something about don't Just recently, a guy approached me. He wants to make a statue of my grandfather.
Really?
In the States, there would have been one in Washington for him.
There'd be
Yeah,
a
there was a
movie.
long time ago, like in the 30s, they would have done that.
Yeah.
Now, I think the suicide had a lot to do with,
Yeah, but
he
Hollywood-
certainly, if anyone deserves one, he does. The vision of public health in Canada,
Yeah.
I mean, it was incredible.
Hollywood would love that dichotomy. He'd be played by Johnny Depp, and it would be all very well lit,
Daniel Day-Lewis. would be
Daniel
perfect. He'd be
Day-Lewis,
perfect. Irish,
yeah. Who are your favorite Canadian authors?
Wow. Well, again, I'm so Canadian because who did I read early on but Americans and Brits,
Yeah.
I mean, and Robertson Davies and Stephen Leacock were old boys of Upper Canada, so we did read them too. But I found them terribly boring and stiff and too British and too
What
colonial.
drew you to the Americans? I mean, myself, I love the American literature. What drew you to the Americans?
Well, everybody, the usual suspects. I mean, Salinger was a huge
Yeah.
thing. And so, like, here's a Canadian thing to do. So here I am, 17, just before the Sally trip, and I wrote an essay. This guy in grade 13, Jay McDonald, the gay teacher, he liberated me and he said, write a parody of anything that we've done on the course.
Yeah.
And so I married the voice of Holden Caulfield to Jane Eyre
Yeah.
because I loved the Brontes. I identified with these girls. There were no girls around.
Yeah.
And Emily Bronte was a genius, And so I thought, I'm going to tell the story of this American vernacular in a Victorian novel. If you really want to know about my crummy life as a governess, So
Yeah.
this teacher read it out to the class, and it was almost the last day of school. I have 10 years in that place, and I walked out on air because it was the first time I'd ever been recognized for anything or seen. I was hiding.
Yeah.
I'd buried, never said anything. I was disappeared. And that was a very liberating moment. But I'm struck by that it was an American and the British texts, right, at Upper Canada College.
Also that you had to go through that 10 years of UCC to reach that point.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the question of free will. You seem very deterministic. Myself, I don't believe in free will. I think it's an excuse we give ourselves to not make decisions a lot of the time. Do you believe in free will? Do you believe that the future exists because of the past?
Well, this is what's for the Sally book and the uncanny and the synchronistic events, almost like quantum theory. I've been exploring that. I mean, this sounds like I'm wriggling off the hook, but they seem to be connected in this mysterious way.
Yeah.
They're both true, right?
That you didn't
And that you
realize.
can, I have moved the needle, through free will. I was determined, or fated, if you like, to follow the footsteps of my father and grandfather. That was the script.
Uh-huh.
But by choice, waking up, listening to my dreams, talking to people, writing books, I'm here today. I wouldn't be here today. I really believe that. I think I'd be dead or alcoholic or drive my car into a tree or accidentally. I really believe that. I think it's that. And I think it's this amazing confluence of forces back to being blessed, born when I was, didn't have to fight a war,
Yeah.
the 60s. So I was able to cherry pick and magpie all these good stuff to help me make sense of all this.
Life makes sense much too late, huh?
Yeah,
We should have it figured out by the time we're 14.
Well, when you die,
It
you
would-
find you're
when you die,
enlightened.
you go,
and-
yeah. Yeah. Which authors and books have stayed with you throughout your life as sources of inspiration and instruction?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm a omnivore, so I read really widely, but mostly nonfiction now. So I love, certainly psychological writers. I'm really interested in stuff about the unconscious and dreams and that stuff. So I read a lot of that. Adam Phillips is an amazing.
Adam Phillips?
Adam
What
Phillips
has
is
he written?
a British psychoanalyst, but he's a critic of psychoanalysis. He sees its faults, and that's what I love about him. He hasn't drunk the Kool-Aid and has any kind of rigid ideological way of looking at things. So he's very philosophical and brilliant.
And he's not tied into the pharmaceutical industrial
Not at all.
complex.
No, he's filled
huh?
with the ironies and paradoxes of it all, and I just find it a real pleasure. He has written about 20 books, and so right now he's my main
I'll have
guy.
to look him up.
Yeah, no,
Is that 2 L's or 1?
2 L's. Yeah, he came to Toronto recently, and
Did he really?
Yeah. I gave him a copy of What Disturbs.
You managed to meet him. Did he have anything interesting to say?
Oh, it was stunning. No, I mean, he's one of these people where he can't write a bad sentence. One of those people. He's just.
Don't you hate those people?
I know. I do hate them.
Right now, are you working on anything, any current projects?
Well, I was saying to you earlier that this is the irony, that because I was so quiet as a child and I was writing my mother's little stories to try to get to her, and I was denied a developmental stage, the oral stage.
Yeah.
I didn't get.
Yeah.
And so this writing has always been this painfully mixed experience because I kind of had to. But I reached a point in my life where this may be it, and I'd much rather do this. Like, this is a real pleasure. I find this is fantastic.
Are you enjoying this?
I can just wing it like I am doing tonight. And believe me, this is a gift for me personally because that's what I wasn't allowed to do.
Now, I would like to give you as much time as you want. Let's say the next 5 minutes. Do you want to? Is there anything on your mind? Do you have any causes or anything at all that you'd like to say to us tonight?
Causes, let me think.
Anything at all that you want to say. Give them a message they can go home with and write in their journals.
Yeah, I guess it's never too late, right? Like, here I am, 68 years old, and I've never felt more alive and more creative, but it's been a long time coming.
But it feels good, huh?
It feels great.
Yeah.
And this is really a key part. I can't underestimate that. I just got an invitation today to speak in Montreal, and just came out of the blue. And so, like, 9 years after this book came out, they've discovered it in Montreal.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Good.
So these books are kind of under the radar. They are.
Yeah.
Because they are disturbing, and they are challenging, and they do stir people up for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
This is why I love your questions, because I in some way, perhaps unconsciously, I'm trying to get at the root of this, the Canadian psyche, if you like.
Yeah.
Like, what is it about, like, we have so many talents that we don't see, and yet we have a lot of hang-ups too, and repressions, and we're trying to throw off.
Yeah.
And we have all this potential to diversity, and we're seeing this exciting, isn't it? I mean, the First Nations voices coming up, and this is one of the ironies that my agent says she can't sell Sally because white males are out. Just out. It's just, I'm out. That doesn't bother me. I got my chocolate cake.
Yeah.
I mean, these wonderfully talented people, they should have up beyond the stage. We're learning from them. They were oppressed in this unfair way. And it's finally the 60s. It took 50 years because that was all happening in the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. That stuff was coming up. It all got put down again. Return of the repressed. It's back. So maybe this time, right? But my only beef is, don't judge me as a white male just on the don't judge the book by its cover, right? That maybe I'm an ally. I've had those responses. Shut up, James.
Yeah.
You have nothing to say to us. That's a problem when the far left tries to censor every voice.
Are you worried about the current political landscape in the world? We seem to be having this. It seems to have sort of shaped itself into a struggle between fascism and democracy.
The split, this big. I know about splits and
there's
polarization.
nothing in between.
And I think that's the appeal of Trump. I think this is his uncanny dark genius. Is he was correct in his perception about the failure of the elites.
Yeah.
And they don't get it. The deplorables. That was the biggest mistake Hillary made.
Yeah.
Like, you don't get it. The condescension and the judging of these. It's true. Upper Canada, they don't care about people in Rexdale or Saskatoon. The same with the liberal elites in the States. They have contempt for the rednecks, and they're not going to get their votes. So Trump really co-opted this brilliantly. He's done it cynically for his own view, but all of the media elites are all sort of puzzled why do they hate us?
Is it possibly because when you bought into something like UCC, you were buying into a program, and maybe that program isn't there anymore?
It's in a more insidious way. It's there.
Yeah.
I went up to my 50th reunion last fall as a Trojan horse just to see what it was like.
Yeah.
And I was appalled.
In what way?
It's a cult.
Yeah.
They sing. They had us in the prayer hall. They had all these guys, 300 guys, singing the Anglican hymn and pitching money, right?
Uh-huh.
And they bring out the head steward. They use the boys as props.
Yeah.
The head steward was this very good-looking black guy who came out, and he's thrilled to be there because he got a scholarship, and he's part of the club now. Good for him.
Yeah.
But half the school is non-white now.
Yeah.
Right? But it's a cultural laundering facility.
So you do see a sort of an evolution of UCC. Then.
It's this core rock. The DNA of the school is intact. The family compact. Protect your class values.
Yeah.
And one of the ways you protect your class values is you become philanthropists. It's very self-serving, but the ultimate goal is you're keeping it all together. You're protecting. It's a garrison mentality.
Something like that, though, it's really, you have to look at the ideal. What is the central tenet? And then you can kind of discard everything around it sometimes,
right.
you know?
They haven't done their, they need a psychic enema, as someone said.
Yeah.
You know, that that's the tragedy. They've had chances to change in moments of crisis, like 15 years ago. They had a chance to change and go co-ed is the most obvious thing to do. But, they just defiantly don't. And it's because the Bay Street cabal runs the Board of Governors. And you could have a well-meaning principal who will come in who has no power. Mm-hmm. I get fed stories that will never be published that are a shock. The reason I'm so passionate about this is I know too much. I know more than anybody, I think, about what goes on. I've fed stories.
What are you going to do?
There's still stuff going on there.
Do you anticipate that someday in the future your original manuscript with all of the interviews will become available? I imagine for those with the endurance, it would be quite an immersion.
Endurance, yeah. I mean, it's hard. It's disturbing stuff because you have to face it, right? I mean, that was always my challenge to them. You guys say you're the elite and the best. Show it.
Yeah.
Show moral leadership. It's like what the Pope's going through now. He's struggling as best as he can. He's cleaning up a big mess, I hope. But now you're seeing guys go to jail, bishops.
Yeah.
This is who imagined that, right? I mean, but then what's the long-term outcome of all this? Where is this leading us? What is the healing look like?
Does it invalidate the institution?
This is all these questions about what does reform really look like, and I know some left-wing Catholics and right-wing Catholics are, it's a battle.
Speaking of religion and the afterlife, the sordid things. First of all, have we covered anything? Is there anything you want to say now that you haven't had a chance to say? Have we done okay?
I could go another 2 hours if you want.
No, that's okay. We'll do this next year. Mr. FitzGerald, sir.
Thank you.
W.C. Fields proposed that his epitaph read, "All things considered, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." Rodney Dangerfield's epitaph reads, "There goes the neighborhood." What would you like your epitaph to read?
Could be worse.
Could be worse.
But actually, this is a parlor game I do with my brother. My favorite is the narcissist's headstone would read, "But enough about me."
Well, we haven't had quite enough about you, but I think we've come close. We have time for questions, if anyone has questions. No questions?
Give them a minute. Yeah. Yes?
Hello. Hi. When you were in the school,
Yeah.
were there policies against your reporting abuse at the time? Like if you snitched on someone at the time, what would happen?
That's a very good question because I think there was an element of training. You didn't even think about it. This is what's sort of remarkable. In the 60s, certainly, right? And I think when the later scandals were happening, when I talked to teachers about this, it's certainly the fear of losing your job, whistleblowing. I mean, I know what it's like to be a whistleblower, and it's kill the messenger, isn't it? So it's a weird dynamic that protects it.
Was there a policy against snitching? Like
There wasn't an open policy.
I'm asking because the school I went to, if you snitched on an abuser, you got punished for being a snitch, and the punishment was the same as what the abuser got. And I'm just wondering if that kind of
I'm sure it was built in a tacit, unspoken way. The boys in the boarding house, you don't rat on your people. That's right. It's a very military thing, It's a very male thing, too, yeah. Anything like vulnerability is the great taboo, isn't it? You see that in that world. That's what these schools are for, is to beat this out of you. Right? Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
Is the prominence of the people who are buying their way with their kid into UCC or
Wherever, yeah.
is it going to come up and be a big atom bomb cloud, or is it just going to drift away because of the ability of the in people to squash the news?
To squash
the news about the women buying or giving favors to staff to make sure their kid gets into the the school or is promoted wherever possible. It's full of the papers are full of it these days.
Oh yes, the recent scandal in the States. Yes, that's right. That's a fascinating story. You see, there it is where you hear this line that they want the best for their children, right? This is back to this issue, right? No, it's the best for them. And that's and the kids didn't even know that their parents were doing this. It is so self-serving and narcissistic. It is shocking. That again, they don't even think to listen to what the kid's talent is, what he really wants, get in alignment with that, support that. But they have to be a reflection of them, almost clones of them. And UCC is full of that, the tragedies of guys who've killed themselves over this. The book opened this up. And in my naivete in 1994, I thought, well, they'll have me up to the school and we'll talk about this. You know.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah.
James, when I was reading Old Boys, I was mostly really fascinated by the older men that you interviewed. They had some phenomenally perceptive things to say about Canada, some things that I had never read before.
Yes.
I was equally unimpressed by the younger men. And I wonder if you have any comment on that. Do you think anything has changed? Is there a different kind of person going to UCC now?
That's very interesting, yeah. It is more diverse, there's no question. So there is, in some ways, an erosion of the old order, like Asian kids don't play football and this kind of thing. But there is this base assumption is still in place, that the parents tell their kid they're going there. It's ultimately, that's the big loop here, that it's because they're still kids and they need guidance by their parents. They're still not sure, especially when you're 8. So there's this real. That's how I remember when I was told by my parents. I was sort of invited to be very excited by this, which I was. But that's what's bizarre that he was so excited. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about the younger ones. Maybe because they didn't go through a war. I don't know. Like there's a kind of more of a shallowness in some of them. Some of them were very thoughtful too. Some of the younger ones, but yeah.
Question. Did you find there was like a caste system at the school? Like maybe the politicians' kids were higher up
Cliques.
than the...
Oh, very much. I think like any high school certainly has that.
But I would think it would have a lot of power with like a lot of money behind.
That's right.
Or notoriety
That's right.
of the parents.
That's right. And it's more
Maybe
concentrated
stronger.
because of the nature of that school, the names. So you have famous names. You have Molson and Ignatieff. And so you're learning that very early. That's part of that. That's one of the privileges of going there. You sort of realize they're just like anybody else. Like I'm not intimidated by these people.
Oh,
I saw when you're a kid, you see them crying in the shower like anybody else. Like they have their vulnerabilities.
Okay.
But you see, I was an observer because I was so backed up, so I was always watching all the time. And so here's Rob Pritchard, who was 1 year ahead of me, and he's an example of someone who bought in deep early on, and he became this consummate networker. He came to me when I was grade 12, FitzGerald, I'll get you to be a prefect next year if you do this, making a deal. I'm looking at, don't do me any favors, like he's made these assumptions, and then he goes off and corporatizes U of T, he was just locked in. He's an example, and he's a liberal. So there were I saw that, so there were cliques of, and you could sort of tell who were the George Orr types, who were the creative rebels who had friends in public school. Oh my God, who had perspective. Yeah, that's my education was my hyper vigilant. It was a defensive position because it was a dangerous place, and so that's what I was constantly, panopticon, just looking on, and turned me into a writer and memorizing. I was always remembering everything, like a concrete, like I exist, and so I was memorized long columns of words instead of having a girlfriend. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, hi. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how unique you think the experience of coming from your background and attending Upper Canada colleges, because it strikes me that there's actually a universality to the experience of becoming what one's parents expect, whatever that may be.
That's right. This is just a more concentrated form, extra pressure because of you're full of this fifth generation sometimes. So that just gives it extra pressure. But you're right. This is true. Immigrant families, and it's all over the place. Yeah, it's just that it's not talked about enough. I think it's this. There's a cultural assumption here, right? And I think the '60s was the first time this was openly and widely questioned, right? And it was so alarming. A thing, chaos, anarchy, right? That was where everybody went. This is the assumption that we're going to go, wait, no, not necessarily. Maybe a better society, But not everybody can become a bohemian and artist. This is the other. We do need lawyers and doctors. And well, you want to get. I love it when I see a doctor and a lawyer who loves what they do. It's a beautiful sight. But I think there are, not that many.
Hello.
Hi.
You mention at the end of your book, What Disturbs the Blood, that you found yourself at the end of this journey that you had taken, edging towards the once impossible prospect of loving and being loved. And I'm just wondering if you'd be open to commenting on that and how the various components that played into you ultimately becoming whole maybe impacted on that.
Yeah, well, it was all part of this journey. It was all built in, and that as I wrote that last part of the book, that's where it was all coming together for me. Like it was like, as I say, I left it open-ended, didn't I? It's like the possibility, like it was like became something that I could finally even imagine as happening to me, because I didn't even think in those terms. I was so out of it in this bubble in myself, self-reliant, and I couldn't trust intimacy with anybody. And so, yeah, it's still an ongoing journey for me. I mean, it's still going on, but I'm light years ahead of where I was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The books have been the catalyst for this, as I said earlier, and it makes me real. It makes things real and human for me and direct experience. I can't emphasize enough this part of it. And this is a fairly recent experience that it was. My experiences would always come back to me as kind of unreal, that I wasn't actually having them. And this has a lot to do with physicality and words and people and directness, and that's how bad it was. So there was a compensation. So that's the tragedy. So you got a lot of bright people who are very articulate and become politicians and leaders, but Michael Ignatieff has that part of, like, he's a brilliant guy. I love his books. He's an academic, but that's why his leadership became a disaster. That people saw this patrician guy, right, in his head, trying to be a Tim Hortons guy. And it didn't work. It backfired terribly. I felt for him. But see, he had the UCC disease, And to his credit, he wrote a book after he was defeated, and he said, I suffered from hubris and naivete. He was set up by the backroom boys. You're going to be the next Trudeau. And he started believing it. He's being groomed, like he was as a child. He started believing his own. He's not a politician. He's brilliant, wonderful other stuff. He's doing great stuff now too. But that exemplifies the problem here. And my father was this. My father was admired. I interviewed all of his colleagues in medicine. They all thought he was brilliant and loved him. And they didn't know he was tortured, drug addict, suicide. We act, we pretend. Right? So the betrayal of the true self is what Adam Phillips talks about a lot of it. That's what is a terrible price to pay, like your own personal authenticity, right? And so many of us struggle for this, because the price you pay is you're going to alienate. If you really tell somebody what you really think and feel, now if you have enough of security, if there's love with the person, you can do that. If you're really loved, you can tell your partner. My partner and I struggle with this. We've evolved together, trying to speak our truths to each other, and we can piss each other off, but we survive it. That's new. I found this after the age of 50. I am grateful for it. She's a therapist, which helps. Yeah, I'm cheating. Yes, exactly. But she ain't perfect, let me tell you. Thank God, she's human, yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Beautiful. Great questions.
We will be back on May the 16th with Carrie Fagan. Check the listings on the TPL website. Thank you all for coming out. James has books for sale, so come on by, get a book, get it signed. Thanks again. You've been wonderful.
Thank you.